If you've been watching my channel for a while, then you know that I use a specific method of note-taking called the zettelkasten system, and if you haven't been around for a while, then hi, I'm Morgan. I'm a PhD candidate, and I am using a specific note-taking style called the zettelkasten to complete my research. But the zettelkasten is not just for academics, it's for anybody that actually wants to document the things that they are learning and taking in every day in a usable format so that they can remember it and use it later. We take in so much information every day, even if we never leave the house, and that information, some of it's really useful, but we don't have a really solid way of documenting it and managing it so that it's usable and findable again. So if you feel like you should be making notes about things happening in your life, but you have no idea where to start or what to take notes about, then this video is for you. If you're not familiar with the zettelkasten, basically it's a note-taking system where you break up information into its smallest parts, and then you connect between all of those parts, kind of like how our brains actually work. And if you want to learn more about this specific system, then you can check out some of these videos that I have made in the past. But of course, you don't have to use the zettelkasten system to take notes, so regardless of the note-taking system you're using, I am going to be giving you 30+ ideas for what to take notes about. Of course, ultimately, I'm not you, and you should take notes about the things that you find interesting and you might use again, but here are 30+ things you could take notes about. At first glance, some of these things might seem a little useless, but I encourage you to give them a try and just see what comes of it, because you will be surprised what you find when you actually document something, how often you can end up using it later. And this video is sponsored by Skillshare, so more on them later, but let's get into the list. The first set of things that I'm going to suggest you could make notes about is things you find in books. For all the readers out there, this list is for you. Firstly, you could make notes about beautiful phrases you find, but don't just write the phrase. You can also say what struck you about the phrase, what makes that phrase beautiful. In other words, in your note, you could investigate the phrase. For instance, Elizabeth Tova Bailey writes in her book, The Sound of a Wild Snail Eating, "Absorbed in snail watching, I'd find that time had flown by unnoticed. And what about the unfurling of a fern frond?" Now, why do I find that phrase so compelling? I think part of it has to do with the fact that she opens a sentence with "and," but it's not totally obvious what the "and" is referring to in the prior sentence, so the reader has to do the work of figuring out what comes before the "and," but also the alliteration and assonance of the unfurling of a fern frond. I mean, come on, that is such good writing. The second thing I'm going to suggest you make notes about is your emotional response to passages in a book. For instance, I recently reread the play Les Belles Sœurs by Michel Tremblay, and the first time that I read this play, the final line really struck me. The final line is Germaine saying, "My stamps!" And when I first read this line, I felt really discontented. I felt kind of uneasy, uncomfortable, and ultimately dissatisfied. And when I thought about it, I realized that that feeling might be coming from the fact that most of the fiction that I consume has a satisfying resolution. And I'm so used to this narrative structure with a satisfying denouement after the falling action that when I read Les Belles Sœurs and there wasn't that satisfying resolution, I just kept falling. And that was uncomfortable. The third thing you could take notes about is a concept or lessons from the text that you could apply to a problem that you're having. So what is your problem and how does this book help you solve it? Another thing, anything that has shifted your opinion on a topic or given you a new perspective. So you can write what your old perspective was, and then you can write where you think that perspective has shifted, and then you can describe that transition, because you never know when you're going to need to teach somebody else this new concept and see how you got there yourself. And if you're taking these notes online, there's probably some metadata that says when you created that note, aka when you had that experience. But if there isn't, then maybe you could put a date on it too, because that could just be interesting to look back on when you learned this new thing. Another thing you can make a single note about is an explanation of a key concept or idea that this author has created or is using. So not all of your notes have to be original thoughts or things coming from your own personal experience. You could also make a note that is explaining somebody else's idea in your own words, and as long as you're putting it into your own words and you're properly citing the original author, then that's going to help you remember that information and turn it into knowledge. Another great thing to make a note about is connection points between the text you're reading and other texts or other things. For instance, I recently read Rick Rubin's book, The Creative Act, and in it he says, "You are never alone when you're making art." And Walter Isaacson has a book called The Innovators, where he discusses how innovation always comes out of collaboration, even when that collaboration's invisible. So these two ideas are very similar, except Isaacson's coming from the space of technology and Rubin is coming from the space of art making. Sometimes an author brushes on ideas that you think are really cool but never goes further in depth. For instance, like this happens a lot in footnotes. So another thing you could do is add like a placeholder note to go and research an idea more. You could say, this author touched on this idea, but they didn't delve further, and so I want to do further research, and you add a kind of placeholder there so that you remember to go back and research that cool idea that they mentioned. Something else you can make a note about is a meta-analysis of the book's structure, like what makes this a good way to structure a product or not, and how could you apply that when creating projects of your own of any kind. For instance, I just started this book where there are so many footnotes, like more than I have ever seen before. Basically every other sentence has a footnote, and so I'm reading it on my computer, and I basically have two PDFs of the book in front of me, one with the actual writing and one with the notes section at the end, just so that I can constantly move back and forth. And that's a really interesting experience that I wonder how it would look if you applied it to, say, a YouTube video or a poem or even like a video game. Another kind of meta-analysis you could do would be about the author's writing style. What literary techniques or patterns does the author use, and how does that affect your likability of the author, their authority as an author, or the message that they're trying to convey? And what can you learn about that for when you're communicating in the written word or even in real life? For instance, there's an author that writes in the field that I'm in that will oftentimes insert themselves into the text by saying, your humble author believes that blah blah blah. And I find it really interesting because first of all, it does make him more likable to me, and it does kind of acknowledge his own bias so that he's not this kind of objective outsider perspective or supposedly objective. But at the same time, I don't think it's really all that humble to like consistently say how humble you are. And I do wonder about putting this strategy into real life conversations where you like acknowledge your lack of authority, but also you still want to say something about this topic. Something else you can make notes about is the historical context for understanding this book. So you're not necessarily going to get that within the book itself, but it's going to help you better understand the book. So it's worth making a note about. And in fact, you can make a lot of isolated notes about this. For instance, to call back to Les Belles Sœurs by Michel Tremblay, I could make a really great note about connecting Les Belles Sœurs and what happens in that play to the Quiet Revolution in Quebec. Did they ever mention the Quiet Revolution in the play? No. But is it set during the Quiet Revolution and maybe it's an allegory for the Quiet Revolution? Absolutely. So this is going to better help me understand and analyze that text. And creating those connection points between the text and things outside of it is really how you're going to help yourself remember and find these notes again. Similarly, you could make a note that is a biography of the author. What else has this person written? What interesting life points have they had? Do you want to learn more about this person or their works? And what questions have they left unanswered in their book? Again, you can add a kind of placeholder note here where you put questions to ponder further. Another option would be things that you disagreed with in this text. For instance, the book that I was reading this morning said that it was drawing a lot from actor network theory, and as much as that's probably true because there's a lot of aspects to actor network theory, I ultimately didn't think it went far enough in that direction because it wasn't touching on the aspects of actor network theory that are particularly interesting to me, and so it's interesting to make a note about that gap. This one's specifically for fiction, but it could also actually work with nonfiction, especially memoir, which is character development. So what is the journey of a single character in the book, and does that character arc remind you of anything? If not, it might later. So you should still document that character's path if it was interesting to you, because then later down the line, maybe 10 years from now, something's gonna happen to you or a friend, or something's gonna happen in another piece of media that is going to remind you of the character arc from this other text, and you're gonna wanna make that connection then. So still write it down. You could also make infinite notes connecting this book to relevant current events. For instance, in his essay Criticism, Matthew Goolish says that the goal of criticism is to make a change, and the only thing you can reliably change is yourself with your criticism. So as a critic, you should assume that the thing you're criticizing has something perfect in it so that you can be changed for the better. And I wonder how discussion around the Oscars, which just happened like 2 days ago for me, would be altered if this is actually how people approached criticism, even in a really informal sense of just like chatting with your friends. And then my last one for the book section would be to compare this book and what happens in it to other media. So how does this book connect to a painting or a YouTube video that you've seen, and what is gained by connecting those two pieces of media? Phew, okay, that's all of the ones that I had for the books, but let's move on to a more generic category of just things that could happen to you on a daily basis. For instance, challenges that you've encountered. What was the challenge and how did you overcome it or not? This is going to be a great example for future notes that you make or future writings that you do or future job interviews that you're in. Like when they ask you, what is the challenge and how did you overcome it? Well, boom, you know. It's in your note system already. But hopefully remembering how you've overcome challenges is also just going to help you overcome future challenges. Next, your decision-making and problem-solving processes. You could actually document the processes that you have used and have worked in your life. For instance, to say overcome a problem or just to complete a task. And that way you can actually apply those processes to future instances of that thing. Next, just jokes and humorous anecdotes. We're always looking for more laughter and light in our life, right? So you could note down any jokes, funny stories, or humorous observations that made you laugh. Next, I've written down interesting conversations. You could actually just document a snippet of a conversation that you've had and why that stood out to you and how maybe you might use it in the future or it applies to something you've experienced in the past. Like imagine you're writing your memoir one day or you're telling your kids about your life and you actually have documented specific conversations that you've had that stood out or were memorable or you wanted to be remembered by. Like how cool would that be? Another thing, you could write down your progress on hobbies. So you could write down the progress that you made and or the thing that you learned in this like hobby progression session or what the experience of learning that thing was like. Similarly to hobbies, you specifically could write down your workout routines. These are always things that I'm forgetting, as well as your reflections on your workout, like how you felt during the workout and any insights you had about it. For instance, today I went for a run after 2 weeks off and I actually managed to run 5 kilometers despite taking 2 weeks off, which felt pretty good. And I did that in my Saucony Kinvara shoes, but I am trying to move to exclusively barefoot shoes. So documenting like how I felt, where I'm sore, I can add to this note tomorrow to say how I'm feeling. That's really going to help me in doing that transition between footwear. And also then, if one day I become the next Chris McDougall and write the next iteration of Born to Run, which is one of my favorite books, then I will have this information documented. Memories in general are just a great thing to document because they could help you better understand who you are today based on your past self. And specifically, I want to mention memories about travel or vacation. Where did you go? Who did you meet? Why was it memorable? The who did you meet is especially important because sometimes we meet people, even if you just say attend a conference, and you're going to forget most of those people. But if you have like an on-the-fly note-taking system where you can document their name, what they might have said to you, and like who they are, then you're going to remember that person better and you are going to hugely impress them when you meet them again later. Another thing, of course, dreams. What happened in your dream and why do you think it happened? I'm pretty sure that writing down your dreams actually helps you remember your dreams better, so if that is a source of inspiration for you, it could be a good thing to add to your note-taking system. Another thing, and this is super vague, but just descriptions of things that you've noticed. Like, your notes don't have to be significant. They don't have to be profound. They don't even have to be new information. You could just like notice something and be like, I wonder why I noticed that, and just describe it in a note. And you never know when that description is going to become useful in the future. Of course, if you are a writer of any kind, then you might use that description in the future literally in your work. But even if you're just a guy, like, you never know when you're gonna wanna remember that thing that you noticed. Another thing, we all eat food. Maybe you want to document recipes you want to try or recipes that you have tried and the ways that you've altered them. This is something I always forget is like I'll alter a recipe in a way and then I'll really enjoy the food, but I didn't document how I altered it and I don't remember it later. So definitely something you can make a note about. Another super important one to me, stress relief techniques and anxiety reduction techniques, because these are things that, you know, I sometimes find in a time of high stress or overwhelm, but then I forget for the next time that I'm going through overwhelm when I really need it. So if you've documented the strategies for getting out of those moments after you have gotten out of them, then if you're using something like a zettelkasten where you're going to be reminded of these things again and again through your notes system, that could be really helpful to like really ingrain it in your brain. And finally, for the general life section, nature observations. There is nothing more fulfilling, I think, than dwelling on the natural world. And if you make observations about nature, you are necessarily making observations about yourself, because humans are natural, like we are a part of nature. Everything we do is in some way a natural process, and so making observations about how nature actually works could help you learn even more about yourself and your own processes. So a big part of the reason that I take making notes so seriously is because I'm a writer and I want to be a writer. Right now I write for an academic audience, and in the future I'd like to do creative nonfiction and write for a general public audience. So lately I have been watching through the classes on Skillshare's learning path about creative essay writing. And in this next part of the video, I'm going to give you 4 things that I actually made notes about while watching those Skillshare classes. Skillshare, as I told you, is also the sponsor of this video, so I will also say that Skillshare is a massive online learning community for creatives with thousands of classes led by industry professionals across film, illustration, design, freelance, productivity, and more, including the professional writers Roxane Gay and Susan Orlean, who both have classes in the creative essay writing learning path. These learning paths are hand-picked classes meant to be taken in order that build on one another, reinforcing lessons.
My name is Susan Orlean. I'm a staff writer at the New Yorker magazine. I've also written about...
So if you want to learn from curated classes from professionals in your field, then the first 500 people to use my link in the description box below will get a 30-day free trial of Skillshare. And now, here are some things that you can make notes about as you watch. Firstly, you could document strategies that these professionals give you to aid you in your craft in the future. For instance, to better understand the moves that authors make in creative nonfiction, Roxane Gay suggested literally printing out an article and then using 2 colors of highlighter to highlight all of the times that the author looked inward versus looked outward. So times they're telling their own story versus times they are connecting that story to something outside of themselves. Something else you could keep a note about is book recommendations. For instance, Roxane Gay recommended the book Reading Like a Writer, which I'm now super interested to read, and if I make a note of who told me the book recommendation, then I can always credit that person and like thank them in the future if I really like the book. Something else would be motivational quotes or quotes that you want to remind yourself of over time. For instance, in her Skillshare class, Roxane Gay says that she has always treated her writing like her job, and so she will like go to work and do the writing. And she says that it's important to take yourself really seriously like that, and says that it's a big part of why she has been successful. And the quote that I wanted to save from her about this was, "Keep your appointments with yourself, even if you don't keep them with anyone else." And I think I'll be thinking about that one for a while. And then lastly, something else you can make a note of when watching educational materials like those on Skillshare are meta-learning reflections. So even if an educational resource is really boring and you don't learn anything, you could still reflect on the fact that you didn't learn anything and investigate why, because you want to save time in the future. Or if you learned a lot, like I did from Roxane Gay in this Skillshare class, you could document what that teacher did right for your particular learning style, or what you did right in preparing yourself to learn that material. And that way you can seek out the best teachers for you and the best conditions for you to learn in the future. So thank you Skillshare for sponsoring this video, and if you want to try some of these note-taking topics out on actual material, then you can use my link below to get a 30-day free trial of Skillshare. And after a certain number of people that have joined by my link, I will also start to get a kickback from those, so you are also supporting my channel by trying out Skillshare for free. Those are all of the note-taking topics I have for you today, but I'm sure that I could come up with a whole bunch more, and I also could go way deeper into any one of the 30+ topics that I mentioned here today. So if you want me to share more topics or go deeper into any one of these, please let me know in the comments section below. I hope this has inspired you to take more notes, take different notes, start documenting things happening in your life so that you can use that material, and I will see you in another video again soon. Bye everybody!